You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is Helen Cullen. Well, thanks for tuning in to Author Stories today. We've got a fantastic show for you. Go to hankgarner.com and subscribe to the show. Any way that you download podcasts, you can listen to it there. I'd like to talk about some sponsors before we get started. Scribophile is a respectful online writing workshop and writers community. Writers of all skill levels join to improve each other's work with thoughtful critiques and by sharing their writing experience. We're the writing group to join if you want to find beta readers, get the best feedback around, learn how to get published, and be part of the friendliest and most successful writing workshop online. Improve your writing by receiving detailed critiques, learn from a vast collection of free writing resources, make lifelong friends in our busy community of writers. Writing is a solitary art, but that doesn't mean you have to be lonely. Lucky for you, there are thousands of writers on Scribophile every day, and we're a really friendly bunch. You've never seen a writing group like this one. Join Scribophile today at scribophile.com. For the Words is a unique writing motivator unlike anything I've ever seen. For the Words is an online writing platform which motivates writers of all backgrounds to increase their word count through gamification. Writing can be challenging, especially when you need to consistently produce a high output of words. By injecting a little fun into that routine and using daily rewards to promote a healthy writing habit, For the Words makes it easier to reach those word count goals. We're a community of bloggers, professional authors, college and high school students, research scientists, gamers, and first-time writers from all over the world. Come for the words, stay for the fun. It's forthewords.com. That's the number 4, thewords.com. Writers. The internet is one of the best tools for research and creativity, but it can also be one of the biggest hindrances to productivity, distracting you from doing the seat-in-chair, hand-on-keyboard work. Rescue Time gives you an accurate picture of how you spend your time to help you become more productive every day. Spot inefficiencies in your day and become better at managing your time. Create a goal, like spending less than 1 hour per day on email, to help you stay focused. Set an alarm to tell you when you spent more than 2 hours a day on Facebook. Try Rescue Time and use our special discount code for 30% off our Rescue Time premium account by going to rescuetime.com/author stories. Let us help you rescue your time. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am really excited to have Helen Cullen on the show with me today. Helen has a fantastic new book. It's called The Lost Letters of William Woolf, and this is a tremendous read in so many different ways. I learned things that I didn't know about the world around me and the machinations of the Postal Service that really spin into a really fun story. Welcome to the show, Helen.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Hank. It's so lovely to speak to you today.
Well, thank you for joining me. We've got a lot to talk about, but before we do, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question. It's difficult for me to remember an exact moment when I thought this is the thing that I want to do. It feels like it's always been there for me. But I do know that the first book that really captured my imagination and probably got me thinking that way was a series of books by Enid Blyton. I'm not sure if Enid Blyton was such a phenomenon in the States as she was over here in England and Ireland, but she wrote this series of books called The Enchanted Wood and The Magic Faraway Tree. And I remember reading those when I was a little girl, and it being the first time that I totally fell in love with the experience of reading. So the seed was probably sown, I think, from that very first explorations of fairy tale storytelling when I was little. But I think I sort of feel like it was always there, even though it kind of took me a long time to actually have the courage to sit down and try and actually do the thing that I'd been dreaming of for so long.
Well, that's what's so wonderful about this question, is that we get to think back to that time when the gift awakened, if we can use that kind of language, that storytellers are kind of born that way, I've found, and that and then there's usually a journey that goes from that awakened thing to being a writer. And that's why writers and storytellers aren't necessarily the same thing, though storytellers can absolutely become writers. But the journey between those two things, I find absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. And I remember when I read The Diary of Anne Frank, there was this line in it where she'd written something like, "I'm grateful to God for giving me this gift of expressing all that is within me."
That is so powerful.
I know, and I remember reading that when I was really little, and it hitting me straight in the heart, that this was something that could happen, that you might be given this gift of being able to express everything that was within you. And I probably was sort of chasing that, from then onwards. It was always there in my imagination as something that I wanted to try and be able to do. But yeah, it did take me a long time to get going.
What was it? You talked about the early fantasy stories and these fantastical stories. What was it that opened your mind about those stories? Was it just the idea of going to another place? Was it the idea that there were things behind things and the story potential there? Can you put your finger on what it was about those early stories?
I think it was something very seductive about how the extraordinary can live inside the ordinary, especially when you're a little girl like I was growing up in the middle of Ireland, where, exciting things didn't really happen that often. I think the books gave you the opportunity where something magical or exceptional or spectacular could happen in an ordinary life. So I think that might have been, where that first real draw came. And the idea that, it could happen at any moment, the exciting, magical thing. And I think I basically spent most of my childhood walking around waiting for the magic. This would be the day when I would discover the portal to the other world, or I would find out that I had some long lost aunt living in a lighthouse somewhere who was going to invite me to come and stay, and I would go on a crazy adventure. I basically was just waiting for it any moment. And I think that came a lot from the reading that I had spent so many hours invested in when I was small. I sometimes, when I'm talking to friends now, they'll speak about their childhoods and, favorite toys they had, or, adventures they went on. And I can only ever think of myself sitting reading somewhere. I feel like that was my whole experience as a little girl. I barely can remember myself doing anything else at all.
I think you and I were exactly the same child. I love that so much. Did you ever have an experience where a parent or a teacher recognized this thing in you and offered any sort of encouragement to you?
Well, I think I was really lucky that my mother and father, but I guess predominantly my mother, was such a big reader. So I always remember there being loads of books and loads of reading and talking about books in our household. And my mum gave me all the books that she had read when she was a little girl. So the kind of classic novels like Little Women and the Laura Ingalls Wilder stories and, all of those kind of canon of children's books. And then we would talk about them. So I feel like the kind of conversation around literature began very, very early on for me. And it was a really important part of our relationship, was the way that we communicated around those stories. So I feel like the idea of taking literature seriously and it being something that was valuable and important was really at the heart of our home, and definitely laid the foundations for me in believing that this was something really valuable. I think when I was in primary school, I always wanted to do the kind of creative writing bit. Whenever we were doing the school plays or the concerts, I was always the narrator. I never played any of the fun characters. I was always the person who would write the script and read it out and narrate the story. So in some ways it's amazing that you're kind of so on brand, when you're little, before you even realize that this is a thing that's going to kind of be, throughout your whole life. But I think I was always a bit nervous about creative writing. I felt really comfortable with the language and doing kind of discursive nonfiction stuff, but I was always a little bit scared about the creativity part. I didn't think I had the imagination for it. And maybe that was just intimidation because, I'd read so much and read so many amazing stories, and I didn't understand, I think, yet that there was a big gap between those authors' first draft and what I was reading, and that it probably didn't appear for them in the magical way that I was receiving it. So I think for me, I felt really intimidated by, just the amazing stories that I was reading, and just didn't think it was something I'd ever be able to do, but was always really encouraged with English studies, with my kind of English schoolwork and my essays that I would write and my interpretation and understanding of the poetry or the novels that we were studying. That was always my strongest subject in school and where I got the most encouragement for sure.
Love that. So what was the thing that, even though you said that you felt inadequate and that you might never rise to the level of the stories that you were reading, writing is such a weird thing that we can feel that way. We can feel inadequate, yet we sit down and we do it anyway. It's so funny that, a soccer player with those same, kind of ideas, doesn't just walk out onto the field and try to join, a professional game. Yet as writers, we do the thing, even though we feel inadequate in the midst of it. I think that's one of those crazy gifts that comes along with the gene, if you want to call it that. What was the thing that pushed you to keep trying and to pursue this as something that you wanted to go to school for and to eventually publish?
Well, I suppose the strange thing is that I didn't really try for a very, very long time. I think I always had the instinct that I wanted to write and maybe worked the muscle in a different way, because after I left school, I went and I studied communications in university, and then I did a theatre master's, and I was working in broadcasting. So I was always sort of writing creatively, but not trying to write fiction. I think it gave me just enough of an outlet that I felt like I was getting some satisfaction from it, but I still found it almost impossible to take the leap of faith into the unknown of sitting down and trying to write a short story or begin a novel. I just didn't believe I could do it. I think I had this idea, it's something that you mentioned at the start, that writers were born and not made. And that if I was able to do this, then I would just be doing it, that it would have happened automatically, and that I wouldn't have been able to resist the compulsion to get these stories told. So by virtue of the fact that I was able to hide from it and put my energy into other things, it made me think that I wasn't the real deal and that I probably wasn't meant to be doing this thing, even though it was sort of, really percolating in me all the time that this was the thing I was meant to do. I just couldn't bring myself to start. And then I think eventually the fear of never writing a book overcame the fear of not being able to.
Yeah. And that's a powerful fear, isn't it? When you know that this is such a heartfelt desire, that fear is it overpowers everything.
I think so. Yeah, it suddenly reached the point where I just felt I can't keep denying this anymore. I have to find out if this is something that I can do. And my partner really encouraged me to take it seriously. And I thought, okay, I need some sort of framework here that will help me make a commitment to this, because I know myself, I'm really good with deadlines and I'm really good with having some structure. And I decided that I would apply for this 6-month novel writing workshop that the Guardian newspaper were running with the University of East Anglia in England. And the premise was basically that it would be a mentored writing workshop where you would try and write the first draft of a novel. So I was basically going from zero to a novel, overnight. But I just thought, well, I'll apply and see if I can get onto it. And the very first thing that I had to write was the first chapter of this book. And it's just remarkable to me now to think how easily it might not have happened, if I hadn't signed up for that 6-month workshop, because I sat down and I wrote the first 4,000 or 5,000 words of what became the novel that I published. And it was like it had just been sitting there waiting on me all of that time for me just to sit down and give it a chance to appear. It was remarkable.
That's so incredible. Because there's so many people that do some sort of formal writing course like you did, and there are just as many people that don't. And I've heard all kinds of stories about some people that really draw great inspiration from an experience like that, or gain some wisdom that they feel is invaluable. And then other folks are like, well, it didn't really do anything for me. This sounds like it was a great experience for you. What is something that you took away from that course that you feel like has really benefited you, and that without that you might not have gone on to do what you've done?
Well, I think, first of all, I guess I'm really glad you brought this up about, people feeling under pressure, that sometimes you have to do some kind of formal creative writing course to help you get your book written or to help you get published. And I don't believe that at all. And I deliberately actually chose at the time not to do an MFA or an MA in creative writing, because I felt I'd basically spent my whole life up until that moment, being a good student and not trying to be more creative and not trying to break away from getting, good grades or, doing the right thing. I wanted to have more freedom and not be thinking about just getting awarded a qualification. So for me, I deliberately stayed away from kind of like a more formal course. And the workshop that I did was very loose, and I think for me, it was the perfect thing at the perfect moment in time. And that was largely because of the woman who was mentoring our workshop, who was this amazing British French novelist called Michelle Roberts. And, she had an amazing reputation before we even began the course. So it was incredible to know that she was going to be our mentor. But actually, the practical experience of being mentored by her was just phenomenal. But I think also was uniquely perfect for me because Michelle seemed to just have a really instinctive understanding of the kind of writer that I was and of what I was trying to achieve, and knew exactly how to talk to me and give me feedback in a way that helped me develop. But I'm really conscious that there were 9 of us who signed up for that course, and the other 8 didn't finish their books. And that wasn't through lack of talent or lack of determination, but just for all the millions of thousands of reasons, that come along that prevent someone from finishing a book. So signing up for a course or taking part in a workshop, I think, doesn't necessarily guarantee anyone anything. It just depends on it being the right thing for you at the right time, as you say. But for me, it was just the perfect combination of things. And I think probably the most valuable lesson that I took away from it was just about the need to persevere and keep going, even when you're not sure how things are going to unfold or what's going to happen next. Because I think if I had actually been on my own trying to write this book without the structure of showing up every fortnight with my 5,000 words for critique, I think I would have panicked when I couldn't see my way forward, which happened loads of times in the course of that 6 months, where I would reach a stage and think, gosh, I really don't know how I'm going to do, what I'm going to do next, how I'm going to bridge the gap between these 2 scenes, or how I'm going to revive this soggy middle of my novel. I would have probably frozen and not known how to progress. And the thing Michelle always said was that if you reach a point in the novel where you don't know where you're going, then just stop and start writing somewhere else in the book. Take your characters and bring them on a day out somewhere, and just let them interact with their surroundings and interact with each other. And don't worry about how this is progressing the plot at all, and just see what comes up. And inevitably, every time I did that, it would reveal something remarkable to me about, either what was happening in their relationship or, how the story was going to unfold. So I think just having that sort of freedom to jump around and not think I had to kind of chronologically keep working. Okay, I've done chapter 6, so the next thing I have to write is chapter 7, was amazingly freeing. And maybe that's obvious to everybody else, but it kind of wasn't obvious to me at the time that I could do that and then just piece it back together retrospectively on the other side.
Well, I don't think that that's obvious to a lot of people. I think that writers are under the pressure to to linearly, say that 3 times really fast, tell the story from beginning to end, because that's how we read, and we just assume that this is how stories unfold, and we can't just let our characters we can't just take them on a day out and find out what they'll do. I'm here to tell them what to do. But writing is that weird thing where we get to talk about characters living their lives and finding out what they're going to do. And, we don't get to talk like that in many other, places in adulthood. It's really, I think that piece of advice alone it would be golden for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was just very freeing to know that you couldn't write yourself into a corner, because you could always write yourself back out again by going in a different direction. And I think, it's so simple, but the thing Michelle said to us every single fortnight when we went home was just keep going. And it became almost like this kind of funny catchphrase that we would say to each other all the time, just keep going, just keep going, just keep going. Don't look back, don't stop and worry about what you've written already, just keep going and get to the end of the draft, because you can sort of fix anything in the edit, hopefully. And you can, finesse your writing. And, the kind of heartbreaking thing is that I know loads of people who have spent, months, maybe years writing the first 3 chapters of their novel over and over and over again. And, I always want to say to them that the tragedy of all this is if when they get to the end of their draft, they might realize that they don't even need those first 3 chapters anymore, or that they need to be something totally different. Because until you understand the whole shape of the arc of your story and, the grand design of your novel, it's impossible to really know what that beginning needs to be. So you're kind of putting yourself under this terrible pressure, when it's probably too early to be worrying about it that much. I think the first draft for me is really about telling yourself what this book is and working out, what's going on. And then the second draft is for that sort of amazing micro editing where you get to do your best writing. For me, anyway, that's what I feel.
Well, we have talked around the book enough. Let's get into this fantastic book, The Lost Letters of William Woolf. Who is William Woolf, and what is his occupation?
Well, so William Woolf is a letter detective in the Dead Letters Depot of East London. And so William spends his day with his colleagues solving the mysteries of all the letters and parcels that get lost in the British postal system. So reading the letters to find clues and opening up all these parcels and either getting them back where they came from or helping them get to their ultimate destination. And so when we meet William in his life, he is really struggling in his marriage to his wife Claire, and things have become very fractured between them. And while he's trying to sort of work out if their marriage can be saved or if there is hope for them at all, he starts finding these letters written by a woman to her great love whom she has never met. So this Irish woman, Winter, is writing these letters and just addressing them to my great love, popping them into the postal box. And somehow they keep popping up in the depot and William finds them. So as he reads Winter's letters, he becomes more and more intrigued by her and the kind of questions she's asking about love and romance and the universe. And it really forces him to really also question for himself his feelings about all of those things, and if his true love is at home in his wife Claire waiting for him, or if it's possible that it might be still out there waiting on him.
The Lost Letters department is something that I was vaguely familiar with. I think I'd heard a story about this one time where these letters that the addresses have disappeared or not legible or whatever. These people investigate to try to find out where these letters go. But when I started reading your book, I became fascinated with this idea. And if you look it up, the United States has a similar. Just about every mail service around the world has a similar situation where people try to investigate this lost mail and figure out where it goes to. Kind of at what point of the process did this idea of this premise come to you?
Well, it's so interesting to me how this all unfolded, because I guess, like we've talked about, the book's not always coming together in a linear fashion. The idea for the depot sort of came to me last in my thinking about what this book was going to be. because I started off really just thinking about the lost art and the power of letter writing. And I wanted to explore this idea about, that had come to me when I thought about, all the people who'd gone off to war when they were so young and wrote letters back home, to the families that they left behind. And thinking about, by the time they came home from the war all those years later, they were totally different people, but their partner or their husband or wife had fallen in love with the person in the letters. And, if you were just writing to someone letters and they'd never met you and they somehow fell in love with what you'd written, would the idea of would the person when they ultimately met you be exactly like you'd imagined, or would it have been this perfectly curated version of themselves that they could never live up to? So I started thinking about all of this. And if a woman was to write letters to her great love that she'd never met, but just working out all her own ideas about love, and she posted them, who could find them? Who would be the person on the receiving end who would discover these letters? And that got me thinking about it, like, where do all the lost letters go? And I thought that I had invented the Dead Letters Depot, which is hilarious to me now because obviously they're so prevalent all over the world, as you say. But I thought I had imagined this like little kind of inner sanctum of the postal system where all the lost mail would go, and that there would be these characters trying to solve all these mysteries. And I managed to make it the whole way through my first draft before I discovered that it was a real thing. And I think I had been nervous about sort of Googling it or researching it in case I found out that someone had written another book or something that was really similar, and I didn't want to have that in my head. But after I'd made it to the end of the first draft, I'd started doing some research and I discovered an interview with a real life letter detective in the Guardian newspaper. And when he talked about the sorts of things that had turned up in the depot, they were even more fantastical and amazing than anything I had been able to imagine, which is just so remarkable. But I think positioning the book in the depot was really unwittingly the greatest gift I could give myself as a writer, because, as you say, anyone could be writing a letter to anyone about anything, and anything could turn up there. So while I was working through the main arc of the novel and telling, the main story, I could deviate from that anytime I felt a bit stuck, or as something inspired me as I was going about my life in London, and turn it into a letter. So it was an amazing way to be able to meander and explore and, tell different stories while I was working out the kind of big picture.
The idea that we are losing this form of communication, the letter writing, it's so prominent in the book because it's really part of the DNA of the book. It's really interesting because my wife and I were going through some of our belongings last night and unpacking a box from when we had moved a year or so ago and just hadn't gotten around to. And I had this whole collection of letters that my grandfather and one of his brothers wrote back home when they were in World War II. And the idea that these things contain the mundane aspects of being in a camp and then detailing the exploits of the day, but then it's really this window into a moment in time that really is becoming a lost art in the time of social media and how we carefully craft the persona that we put out there, and we tell the truth, but only sometimes, and only when we can spin it. What is the lost art of letter writing doing to us, do you think?
Oh gosh, well, I sort of feel like that. In this digital age that we live in, where through technology we can communicate more efficiently and economically than ever before, we have somehow become more disconnected and lonelier than we've ever been. And I think a large part of that is to do with how disposable our communication is now. So, we fire off a text message or an email and it takes us 30 seconds, and that's how much thought goes into the sending and in the receiving. Whereas when we sat down to write these letters to each other, I think, first of all, it's a really meditative thing to do. You're really close to your subconscious, because your brain process has to slow down to keep up with the labor of your handwriting, and it forces you to think in a more considered way. And by virtue of the fact that the person won't be able to respond immediately, and you have to consider what their reaction is going to be when they do read it. You're really choosing very carefully the way that you deliver that your message. And I think, because we wrote to each other like that, it really caused us to have much deeper and more profound connections with the people that, we were writing to, in a way that we're just missing from our lives now. And I think across the board, we're really missing some of these physical, tangible ways of connecting with each other. I think it's the same reason why, vinyl records have had a big revival, and, why we've started, it's become so fashionable to make our own clothes again and to do slow cooking and to be baking. We want tangible, real things that make us feel human and make us feel connected to the world around us. And I think I'd love to see there being a letter writing revival. I think we're really missing it more than we realise by not having this different way of talking to each other. And, it breaks my heart that there's a whole generation of young people growing up who will never know that thrill of a letter landing on their mat with their name written in the hand of someone who loves them. I mean, I don't think there's anything more exciting in the whole world. I really don't. And I think it's really tragic that people have become kind of afraid of it and sort of think that it's, a waste of time. I mean, letters aren't like fax machines. Fax machines can die away and we're happy to let those go. But I think the letters bit, we threw the baby out with the bathwater there big time.
Right. The name of the book, The Lost Letters of William Woolf, is an interesting title because William has a very specific job where he's tracking down very specific people and trying to get pieces of mail delivered so that he can complete the cycle, so that he can make sure the intended recipient gets what they intended, and it's a very specific thing that you can kind of put your finger on, if you will. And then he comes across these letters that are more ethereal in nature, if you will. What does that do to William in that, is this a mystery that can be solved? And what does that do for his own situation? Can you kind of walk us through the thought process of having William come across these letters that challenge him in ways that he's not prepared for?
Well, I think what's really interesting about William's response to Winter's letters is that it is a different sort of mystery for him, because obviously the person that she's writing to doesn't exist. So normally, he would be piecing together the clues, and there, as you say, there's loads of examples of them in the letter, where he would be trying to track down a specific person who he knew existed at a particular point in time somewhere, in the world, and he can trace the clues together to, hopefully get them, the parcel or the letter that was meant for them. But Winter is writing to somebody who, as far as he's aware, doesn't exist. So on one level, there's slightly an ethical quandary for him, because, should he really be investing time in these letters when he knows that he doesn't really have a role to play here at all? But he becomes really fixated by her and by, the way that she's moving through the world and the questions she's asking about life. And one of the things that I was really interested in when I was writing the book, is that the juxtaposition that often exists between the way romantic love is portrayed in movies and songs and books, and then the pragmatic reality of sustaining a relationship over a long period of time. So, we find William, and he's in that pragmatic relationship that he's trying to sustain, and that he believed, for a very long time, was with the great love of his life. So it's very unsettling for him when he starts, receiving these letters from a woman who seems to be able to see to the heart of him, and who makes him remember, what he had hoped for from love in his life. And it makes him kind of wonder and question, is his marriage all that he could ever have hoped for? And is there something else out there for him? So it feels like she's writing to him, even though she couldn't possibly be. And ultimately he does really start to think about, is this the universe, working its magic? And, is he her great love? And she just hasn't met him yet. And, should he find her and find out? So it becomes a mystery that he feels he has to solve in order to find the answers about his own marriage also.
Right. Well, we won't give away that mystery. People need to read this for themselves. When you finish writing this story that came to you a little out of order and a little disjointed, if we think about the linear path to writing a novel, at what point did you realize, okay, I've captured the story, this is the essence of the story, and was it easy to get through to the ending once you kind of saw the big picture of the book?
Well, I think the second big draft that I did was probably the most critical one, because it was the first time I had really tried to assemble all the disjointed chapters that I had together and sit down and try and have the experience of reading it as a whole. And it was obviously, I'm sure you can imagine, terrifying, because it didn't work at all. Because, I would jump from season to a different season a chapter later, and it was so rambling and disconnected that it felt like a massive undertaking to try and piece it together. But it feels like a different sort of skill at that point. And I really enjoyed the challenge of sort of constructing the novel from all these disparate parts. And so I think the second draft is really about putting a kind of a cohesion on the whole narrative. And then I had to let it settle again and then work through it, in a kind of a more micro way to make sure that all the connections were really working now. So it went through quite a few phases before it reached something similar to the version that you and the other readers will have sitting in front of them now. And it was definitely a challenge that I promised myself I wouldn't do again, in terms of having written it so non-linearly. But actually, as it turns out, with the second book that I'm just finishing editing at the moment, I did almost the same thing again. So I'm worried this probably might just be the only way I know how to do it now.
Well, and if it is, then it's working pretty fabulously so far. So don't fix what isn't broken, I guess.
Oh, thank you. I think actually there's something interesting about the way I write, by virtue of the fact that I worked in a journalism broadcasting background before. I find if I don't let myself sort of roam freely and follow the energy to whatever bit of the book is in my mind, my writing tends to go a bit flat, because I sort of start writing to brief, if that makes sense. You know, if I feel like, okay, no, I'm just going to write the next chapter and it needs to be a scene that will get them back home, and I sit down and try and write it, even though I haven't felt the kind of instinct to do that yet, it usually doesn't work. Whereas, if I let myself kind of like play a bit more and think, oh, actually, I'm not sure what's going to happen next, but I definitely know at some point they're going to be in Paris for the weekend, and I really want to write that, and I let myself follow the energy to that scene, it usually works so much better for me. So I think I'm just going to have to give in and accept that I'm always going to have a sticky second draft afterwards when I have to try and piece all of these things together.
Well, I think that's a really great point that you bring up, that I think that's a challenge that a lot of writers go through, is the idea of knowing where the story is going, but just becoming a reporter, so to speak. They went here, they did this, they said this, and just kind of getting through what you know, instead of allowing the characters to live in that situation and then report on what's happening. I think there's a very different feel to those situations, where instead of just giving you a bulleted list of what happened, really letting them live in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you say, you can spot it a mile off, because, I had it was amazing. After I wrote the first draft of the new book, Michelle Roberts, my mentor, who I had met in the writing workshop and has stayed as my mentor, which is amazing. When she read the first draft, she could pick out, what I had called in my mind my bridge scenes, where after I had kind of written it and felt a bit, maybe that jump in timeline is too severe. I should probably write something there to bridge the time. And it was remarkable, because almost without exception, she was able to say, I don't really understand why there's this scene here, filling the time between. And I was like, I know, I'm sorry. I just felt I should drop back in, because I was, they were gone for too long. And she was like, no, get rid of it. You don't need it. You don't need it. And it was really amazing, in terms of me sort of trusting my instincts on that stuff, that I could let the story be what it needed to be and not feel like I had to fill in the gaps.
Love that. Well, the new book is The Lost Letters of William Woolf. It is now available everywhere when you're hearing this. No matter where you're reading, you can find it in physical copy and ebook form, audiobook form. However you love to consume books, you can get your hands on it now. Helen, this has been so much fun. Talking, if people are just learning about you and want to follow along with all of the news coming up about the new book and the release of The Lost Letters of William Woolf, is there a place they can find you online to follow along with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and everywhere, my handle is @wordsofhelen. And I love hearing from readers. And if anyone wants to write me an actual letter on pen and paper, I promise I will write back.
Excellent. That is a fantastic idea. Helen, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. We're going to send everyone to see you and to get their copy of The Lost Letters of William Woolf.
Oh, thank you so much, Hank. This has been such a pleasure.